Hello and welcome to the darkened room of music conversation.
I'm Darren.
And I'm Chris, and on today's episode, we're going to talk about the history of women in rock and kind of touch on, the beginnings and why it seemed like that they didn't play as big of a prominent role in the classic rock era, what we call classic rock today.
Right.
And, where it did eventually lead up till today.
Okay, sounds like fun.
Yeah. So, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around why in the rock and roll era, the hard rock era, that women didn't really play a big role. Mm-hmm. Because considering where rock and roll came from, its basic roots back in the blues before rock and roll was even a thing.
Right.
We're talking pre-1955.
There was a lot of women.
There was, yeah. And some very influential women, too, in the blues.
Sure.
Memphis Minnie would be one of them. And Sister Rosetta Tharpe. There were many artists who covered her songs, like Jefferson Airplane, and what was another one?
Led Zeppelin,
yeah. So yeah,
doesn't get any better than that.
About as influential as you can get.
Sure.
And of course, Big Mama Thornton. She was the one who recorded Hound Dog before Elvis did.
Right.
In 1955, which is where rock and roll kind of had its official start. Was with Elvis Presley.
Right. Yeah. Right. And then, it's kind of funny because you don't think of like country music as being ahead of the curve, but it almost seems like country music was more accepting of females. I'm not saying they weren't discriminated against. I'm not saying it wasn't tough for them.
Right.
But if you think about early forms of country, as far as popularity goes, you had Loretta Lynn, you had Patsy Cline.
Patsy Cline was awesome.
Amazing singer.
Yeah.
Holds up very well to this day. Brenda Lee, she was kind of claimed by country, even though she kind of went more pop and stuff as she went along.
Yeah, Brenda Lee was kind of one of the bridges between country and rock, which was, rockabilly.
Sure.
That's kind of where she fell in.
Yeah, I agree with that. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of an interesting time as far as leading up to the classic rock era, everything that happened as far as women were concerned. So we're going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, a little bit. And, if you consider, when rock and roll first came around, it became a machine where the industry was trying to just crank out artists and hits and try to make as much money as possible.
Right.
If you consider the fact that a lot of the people running the music business, especially there in the beginning, were men. Mm-hmm. So you had men, writing the songs, and it was a natural transition to men actually singing the songs.
Right, and all the musicians, for the most part, in the studio were males. And, that changed a little bit. You had, like, Carol Kay in the 60s, an amazing bass player, part of the Wrecking Crew, who came along. But primarily, you're exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, back then, you think about traditional female roles, 50s into the mid-60s,
Leave It to Beaver and all that,
It was very oppressive to women,
It was.
You're growing up, you were expected to find a man, get married, have kids, know how to cook, keep a clean house. That was all women were expected to do.
Exactly.
They weren't handed instruments and say, hey, here, learn how to play guitar, play some rock and roll. It just didn't happen. No, women, of course, I'm throwing out a blanket statement.
Yeah.
They would play some instruments, but it was like violin lessons or they would take piano lessons, and not the rock and roll piano. It'd be the classical piano. It would not be in the vein of rock and roll.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's very true. Beginning in the 50s and throughout the 60s, the landscape of music in general had started to change.
Yeah.
And I think what the biggest change was, the 45 single had been around a long time, but you started to see with rock and roll artists like, Chuck Berry and your Little Richards and your Elvises, that, it was more marketed towards kids, and kids took a bigger role in liking this stuff. Prior to that, you had a lot of the easy listening stuff, which was like your grandma's music.
Yeah.
And older people like that too. And I'm not saying stuff like Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra wasn't cool.
Right.
But, this stuff was more hip.
Right.
And it was only natural that over time that women were going to like this style of music and want to perform some of it. So as time rolled on into the 50s and into the 60s a little bit, you started seeing female artists in the mainstream.
Yeah, they were showing up for sure.
So leading into this period, you had actually female jazz artists that were kind of crossing over and getting some popularity. You had like the Dinah Washingtons of the world and Etta James. I mean, come on, does it get any better than the song At Last? I mean, that's just a beautiful song, great song.
Iconic classic song, absolutely.
No doubt about it. And then, transitioning more into the 50s and the 60s, you had like Laverne Baker, very influential. Leslie Gore, Jackie DeShannon, and then that led us right smack dab into the Motown era, which was just prevalent with female artists and groups.
Right.
And it was just a total fruitful situation for women at that point.
Yeah, you had the Supremes, you had Gladys Knight. I mean, these are major superstars in that world. All female.
Tammy Terrell, Mary Wells. It just went on and on. Yeah. And so I think that was one of the first times that there was like this movement of women. And I don't know if they even, manufactured it that way on purpose, but it happened. Yeah. And there was a lot of women being played on the radio at that particular point in time.
Yeah, and that kind of led into the singer-songwriter era where women were really becoming prominent.
For sure.
Your Joni Mitchell and Carole King.
Laura Nyro.
Yeah. And then, the Mamas and Papas were out at about that time.
Right.
And Mama Cass. And,
Even though John Phillips wrote the songs, the majority of them anyway, he had two females in the band that were really just as identifiable as the men.
Absolutely, yeah. And, of course, you can't not think about Jefferson Airplane, Grace Slick, and her powerful voice.
Exactly. Yeah. And she was known as, a rocker chick. She was cool.
She was.
The dudes were like, she kicks ass.
And she had a little attitude behind her.
Exactly.
But it wasn't until Janis Joplin came along that we really saw the true grit and attitude that a female could have in the rock and roll world.
That's right. She took, a lot of influence from the blues and all that stuff, but really brought it to the modern plate alongside, the Jimi Hendrixes of the world. She sounded fine played next to that stuff.
Yeah, totally.
And that had really not happened prior to that.
That's true. And then, Linda Ronstadt was bubbling up around that time as well.
Yeah, and Linda was one of those bridge artists. I think she's possibly the greatest female singer who ever lived. And, she came around at the end of like the Flower Children era, with the Stone Ponies and different drum and stuff like that. But then she transitioned beautifully right into the California sound, coming out of the Crosby, Stills and Nash stuff, into the Eagles and that whole West Coast pop. She was right there.
There would be no Eagles without Linda Ronstadt.
Exactly. I mean, Don Henley played drums. Glenn Fry was an accompanying guitar player and vocalist in her band. Yeah. So there you go. There you have it. I mean, if not for just that even, you couldn't tell the history of rock and roll without Linda Ronstadt.
That's right. So, as you can see, leading up to this era, women are making their contribution. They're finding their place in rock and roll. So when the 70s came along, what happened? Now, you can't totally discount women in the classic rock era because they were certainly around and they were making a huge impact. Yeah. And that might be one of the reasons why they were so huge is because they were different and it was noticeable. It was refreshing to hear. Yeah. You think about Fleetwood Mac. You had Christine McVie and Stevie Nicks in there.
Right.
Just powerful, iconic voices from the classic rock era. And then, of course, Hart comes along. Yeah. And this is where the real balls starts to kick in.
One of the most powerful singers ever.
Absolutely, yeah. Ann Wilson, and just a great voice. Yeah. And they could do everything from the softer...
folky type stuff.
Folky type stuff. And then they could also, hit you over the head.
Like Zeppelin style.
Exactly right. Yeah, you had Barracuda and Crazy on You. Like that stuff's kicked ass.
And that had never happened before, where a female was actually emulating Robert Plant in this case.
Yeah, and it was a little shocking to the world. Yeah, especially in the classic rock era, which they just called rock back then. Right. But yeah, it was very rare for women to actually come across as the aggressor.
Right. So I guess what you're getting at is, I wonder why there weren't more female artists in the classic rock era.
Right, yeah. Most people would expect men to be the aggressors. Yeah. So there's a lot of men, in the Led Zeppelin style, in the Rolling Stones, the harder edged rock stuff. It was male dominated because males had, the expectation that they were going to be the badasses.
Right. And then, during this time, it wasn't like women were absent from the radio. They were, very prevalent in other genres, the disco movement. Yeah. The singer-songwriter movement, which you hit on before with the Carole Kings and people like that. And
that carried on through the 70s.
That carried on. And then just in the pop world in general, I mean, you can just say, Debbie Boone, I'm just off the top of my head, Maureen McGovern, you think of all these AC Easy listening songs that were just humongous in the 70s. 70s. A lot of females.
Yeah. So, they were definitely around, but they weren't,
playing rock and roll.
They weren't picking up their guitars and smacking you upside the head with them,
Right. Right.
They didn't have the attitude. Now, they were around, and they were kind of bubbling under, such as the Runaways.
Yeah.
The Runaways came along, and they had, the real attitude behind them. They came out of kind of the punk world. You had Joan Jett and Lita Ford in that.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about both of them a little later because they made their impact down the road a bit.
You're right, but they were there in the 70s, in the mid 70s. They were there.
That's right. So the whole punk movement, was kind of bubbling under in the late 70s, and there were some women that were attaching to that.
Yeah.
You think of Debbie Harry and Blondie.
Yeah.
The Pretenders.
They masterful group.
Very. Chrissy Hynde, one of the greatest rock voices in one of my favorites for sure.
Completely agree.
Yeah, Pat Benatar was also, bubbling up.
One of the best singers who ever lived. Pat Benatar, in my opinion, doesn't get enough credit.
Absolutely, yeah.
But, you notice that there weren't a whole lot of these female singers, but the impact that they made and still have to this very day is phenomenal. So you got to ask yourself that question. Was it the labels purposely avoiding signing female artists? Or did most females get influenced by other things like the pop and stuff that we talked about? And they just weren't a lot of females playing rock and roll. That's the question.
That's true. And another thing to consider is during this era as well, radio stations and radio programmers, when they would actually start, programming or figuring out what songs they want to play on their station, there was an unwritten rule, and this is absolutely a fact. This actually happened, that no station would play two female artists back to back. In fact, there in the very beginning, if they already had a big hit song like in their top 10, say it was a Pat Benatar song, they wouldn't add another female record until that started to drop off the chart.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, so there was a lot of bias in the radio industry, which was holding it back, which is probably another reason why the record labels weren't seeking them out, because they knew radio wasn't going to play it as prominently, which doesn't drive record sales. So it was all a domino effect.
Right, and then once again, you had men running the show.
Exactly right.
So coming out of the classic rock period of the 70s and into the 80s, women were there.
That's right. They were banging on the door, ready to come in. And a little thing happened that kind of took some of radio's control away from them. Now we have music videos on a little network called MTV.
This is true.
Yeah. And MTV broke out a lot of bubbling underground kind of stuff. In 1981 is when they came on the air. So like the Go-Go's and Bow Wow Wow.
The second video they ever played was Pat Benatar.
That's right. Pat Benatar was one of the first videos.
Yeah, second.
So they had started to break out more female artists who were coming from kind of the alternative world, kind of the new wave world.
Right.
And it started to really change the landscape.
And let's, be honest here. If you were an attractive female, it wasn't like MTV was going to shy away from that.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Image suddenly became an important piece in the music business.
Right.
So, and that's what a music video was. It was all imagery.
Right.
But of course, you still had to have really good songs.
Yeah.
There was a lot of great stuff that came out in that era. You had Quarter Flash.
Love them.
Yeah, Quarter Flash is absolutely awesome. Susie and the Banshees and the B-52s were pushing the alternative sound at the time.
So fun. Love it.
Yeah, very much so. And then, as mentioned before, Joan Jett.
Yeah, Joan Jett.
She became a superstar in her own right in the 80s.
I'll never forget when I Love Rock and Roll was a new song. You could not get away from it. It was
it was everywhere.
Everywhere. All the time. And then I remember when Crimson and Clover came out, the follow-up. It was it felt almost as huge.
It did,
It got played all the time.
Yeah. So other great stuff that came out then. You had the Motels.
Great band.
We got introduced to the Eurythmics. Annie Lennox's great, powerful voice. Scandal.
Yeah, Patti Smythe was actually asked to take the place of David Lee Roth and Van Halen. So that kind of shows you how women were elevated and looked at in a much higher regard by the mid-'80s.
Absolutely. And also, Till Tuesday, one of my favorite female vocalists of all time is Amy Mann.
Yeah, the first time I heard Voices Carry, I'm like, this is so different.
Yeah.
And so cool.
Yeah.
That, I'd never heard a voice like that on the radio.
Same here, yeah.
And I hear it today, and it's still fresh sounding to me.
Yeah.
I just love it.
Yeah, so they all opened the door for women to come flooding in. And then as it got more into the 80s, you had big hits from artists like the Bengals. I mean, how many number one hits did they have?
A lot.
Quite a few, yeah. And, of course, bubbling under in the alternative world, there were still lots of women, 10,000 Maniacs, Natalie Merchant, who kind of made an impact in the 90s.
Yeah.
And, Tracy Chapman had probably one of the most iconic songs ever with Fast Car. I mean, that song is still revered to this day. Absolutely.
Melissa Etheridge, let's not forget her.
Absolutely.
You know, in the mid-'80s, I mean, when she came on the scene, man, it was like, whoa. Yeah. This is something different. This is cool.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it just felt like music was kind of going in a different direction. You could almost say like the Tracy Chapmans and Melissa Etheridges of the world were actually leading the trend at that point.
Absolutely, right into the 90s. Now, we can't leave the 80s without at least mentioning the hair metal movement.
Sure.
You had your Bon Jovi, you had Whitesnake, you had Def Leppard. That was a huge movement at the time as well.
And you felt like that was primarily aimed at young males, which it kind of was, the subject matter. Listen to the Whitesnake songs, and they're basically all the same subject matter.
Pretty much so, yeah. But, there were still women contributing to that movement as well.
Exactly.
One of the first ones, I think, was Girl School.
Yeah, Girl School.
Yeah, and Vixen was another one.
Yeah, great band. And I saw them live, and they were incredible. They were really a good band.
Yeah, and once again, the aforementioned Runaways alum, Lita Ford.
Lita Ford, yeah. She was really kicking it into high gear by the mid to late 80s.
Yeah, I remember when Kiss Me Deadly first came out, I'm like,
it's a huge song.
This is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Female doing this style, and then, of course, she did the duet with Ozzy Osbourne and became just a mega star at the time.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So all this leading into the 90s, we know what happened in the 90s. We did an episode on that on 1991, 1992. Links right here if you want to watch that. Yeah. Nirvana comes along, and all the females down in the alternative movement, they start getting lifted up into the mainstream rock world, like L7 and Concrete Blonde. Yeah. And of course, Hole didn't come along until, as far as popularity goes, until, she married Kurt Cobain. But still, she had kind of already been in that world to begin with.
Right.
And she was filled with attitude. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, and we saw Whole Live together. They were incredible.
They sounded really good. I was impressed.
It was fun and entertaining.
That's right. That was about the time that Courtney was starting to do all of her stage antics.
Yeah, she was getting out of control.
Yeah,
before long.
So we were like trying to guess what she was going to do tonight, and she kept it pretty tame that night.
She did.
So the females leading into the early 90s like this opened the door for Alanis Morissette.
Correct.
Alanis came along with Jagged Little Pill.
And she was the ultimate bridge between, she rocked a little bit.
Yeah.
She had Taylor playing drums for her at the time, who ended up being in Foo Fighters.
That's right.
Flea on bass, and that stuff was played on rock radio.
Yeah.
The stations that played what they called active rock or whatever they called it then, modern rock. She fit right in.
That's right. Sadly, though, it was still kind of controversial. It was still kind of a shock to the system to hear a female, singing about shenanigans going on in movie theaters and just, anti-man. It was not that well accepted.
This is true.
Yeah. And you had No Doubt, with I'm Just a Girl, very, a
very political song.
Yeah, very pro feminism kind of thing.
Right, right. And I loved it. I thought
it was fantastic.
I thought that album was just. I listened to it over and over. Sheryl Crow around the same time.
Exactly right.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is a lot of these rock females, like your No Doubts and your Alanis Morissette's, Sheryl Crow, it did kind of lead into, because they also had this other side that was a little more mellow.
That's true, yeah.
And that kind of, you started seeing that side of things come into the forefront.
That's true, and isn't that ironic?
No. It
isn't. Yeah, you had the Cranberries, who came out as a very soft, kind of band, and then the next thing you hear out of them is Zombie.
Yeah,
holy
kick-ass song.
Yeah, so that, you kind of had both living together. Kay's Choice had a great song with Not an Addict.
Veruca Salt.
Yes.
Love those girls.
Oh, yeah.
They were amazing.
Yeah, so you had the punk rockers like that, then you had the softer side like Mazzy Star, one of my all-time favorite songs, Fade Into You.
I love that song.
So yeah.
Oh my God, I love it. But then you even had like bands like Metallica. They took Veruca Salt out on the road with them.
They did indeed.
They opened for them, and Bob Rock produced their album because of the Metallica connection.
That's exactly right.
So everybody was living together, getting along, and it was just a beautiful time.
That's right. Now, a lot of the female artists during that time stuck with the softer side. You think about the whole Lilith Fair style of rock, if you want. Sarah Mclaughlin, of course, being the forefront,
the pinnacle of the mellow alternative stuff, in my opinion.
Exactly, yeah. And I saw her live, front row center.
Incredible.
And she's fantastic.
Amazing.
What a great
singer.
Performer.
Great songs. I mean, you can't say anything negative about Sarah Mclaughlin. And when you see her live, she's very pretty.
That's right, yeah.
Very pretty.
And, you had Jewel and Paula Cole.
Yeah.
I'd say Sheryl Crow kind of fit into some of that, although she had a little grit.
Yeah, she was both. And that's what I was saying, kind of my point about Alanis and Sheryl Crow, and No Doubt. They could do the mellow stuff, but then they had the rock integrity, too.
That's right. Yeah, and there was plenty of attitude still among the female performers. You think about Meredith Brooks with her song Bitch. I mean, that's about as ball-busting as it gets.
True. That's true. But you could tell at this point in time that women were here to stay in rock and roll.
That's right, which also carried right over into the new metal. When your Limp Bizkit, your Kid Rock, and Korn, suddenly broke the hard rock door back down again.
Yeah.
You had Evanescence come along. And, Kitty. I think we saw Kitty at Ozfest.
At Ozfest, we sure did.
And, they were like heavy metal.
Yeah.
From the classic rock era on. No matter what style came in, what was cool and hip at the time, women were there and they were making their contribution. In a major way.
This is true.
And leading up through today, I mean, there's still plenty of female rockers.
Women rule.
That's right. Yeah. Sometimes
love girls.
Sometimes they do it better than men.
No doubt. And they're smarter. Don't forget that.
That's right.
They're always smarter.
That's exactly right. I'll agree with that. So there's our take on the history of women in rock and roll.
And I'm sure we left some females out in all these categories. We just tried to hit on some of the highlights. So, let us know if there's people that you think we should have talked about. You can throw them in here. This wasn't like a total list, comprehensive show.
Sure.
We just wanted to go, covering 80 years in 20 minutes is kind of difficult, so we can't mention everybody.
That's true. They're still making an impact today. I think about there's a band called Miss Mister that has a female lead singer. It's fantastic. If you've ever heard them, check it out.
Yes.
Tell us what you think. Drop down in the comments. Is there like some modern female artists that you think kick ass today and maybe we haven't heard it?
Yeah,
let us know.
Check it out.
Click like on the video and let's play some trivia.
All right.
Trivia box. Let's see what we got this time. All right, the category is the 90s.
Okay.
All right, maybe this will be a question about a female.
Let's hope so.
Okay. Who had the 1998 smash hit, My Heart Will Go On?
Not exactly a female rocker, but I'm going to let you do the honor on this one because you absolutely love this artist, so it's fine.
I actually do. You know what? I'm not ashamed to say.
Did you see her in concert?
I saw her in concert just 2 years ago.
And you said she was amazing.
She was actually great. Great performer, great stage presence. And, she did all of her, you could tell, they're all live vocals, no voice or pitch correction.
Yeah.
She still has it, even at her age.
It's good to hear.
Talking about Celine Dion.
So, early on, I actually kind of liked Celine Dion when she had Where Does My Heart Beat Now? I think that was her first single way back when, like in the early 90s. Maybe it was even 1990. And I could just tell, it's like, man, she's kind of got that Michael Bolton-esque quality, except she's a female.
Yeah.
And before long, man, she was through the roof, through the stratosphere.
Yeah.
And when Where Does My Heart Will Go On. Too many damn heart songs.
Yeah, I know. We ain't talking Barracuda either.
But yeah, by the end of the 90s, I mean, she was just a humongous star. And I know that soundtrack for Titanic sold like in the multi-millions. One of the biggest selling albums of all time.
That's true. And that's, definitely a historical event. And,
sure.
You got to give it props for that.
No doubt about it. And you know, I don't hate on her. I make fun of you for liking her, but
yeah, I know. But
it's
for the longest time, I tried to keep it a secret from people. But like, why? You know, I like what I like.
Exactly.
Screw you if you can't handle it.
Yeah, and speaking of which, we've had a Guilty Pleasures episode.
That's right.
Click on it.
Check it out.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. We'll be back again with another episode very soon. Take care.
See you.